Hey, welcome back to Unschooled Theology. I am one of your hosts, Derick. With me today is Evan. Good day, sir.
Good day to you, sir.
All right, let's after our 5 episode trek through two verses, we managed to return to one episode, one verse today. So that's exciting. So
It's blistering speed.
we're going to take a look here at Genesis 2:18. Then the Lord God said, "It is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him."
And then God invented Alexa.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. A helper fit for us.
That was Senior Jeffrey, I guess. Never mind.
Yeah. All right. So what jumps out first about this verse to me is that this is the first time we have God referring to something as not good. And this is a contrast from what we've seen previously in the first chapter specifically, where there was the repetition of God creating, looking at creation and seeing that it was good. And so here is the first time he's found something that's lacking. And we should also note that prior to this point, good equated with fitting within God's order, and thus not good would indicate the potential disruption of that order. So the aloneness that God wishes to address here is something that has the potential to break the order of God, right? That's the key moment here, is the not good. It sort of is the instigation for the rest of this part of the story. It's also, this is the first point at which we see, I think, a reference to the idea of need. Everything God's made to this point, every description so far, is that it's a thing which, is complete for the purpose for which it exists. But it is man and man alone that God sees as incomplete. So it's curious to think that in all creation, that which God has made to be nearest to him is the only thing which is so obviously lacking up until this point. So that to me is interesting. And so that brings us to what we should really consider here is, why did man need help? Why? Where did this need and this not goodness come from? What is man lacking that requires assistance? So I think the answer here can be found by considering what is lacking and working within that, the idea that all the other creatures have what they need. So all the other creatures were given the order to multiply and fill the earth. And based on the fact that there's no description of need in terms of them and requiring something, they must have everything they need. Man, though, is given the additional task of subduing the earth, right, beyond the multiplying and filling it. So the incompleteness, the inadequacy with which the help is meant to address must be related to that part of the task. So that is part of why I see what unfolds in these coming verses as being about something deeper than just the creation of men and women, because there's nothing to indicate here that the animals were lacking in terms of having male and female versions, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So that they might multiply and fill the earth. And so if that was the concern here, was merely about that, about there being male and female and then multiplying and filling the earth, then there would have been the same sort of description for animals also needing that same thing, if that was the need we were addressing. But because the need for help is different, in the case of man here, the help must be about addressing that greater task. And since animals also have a male-female dynamic that assists in their task, then it can't be just the male-female dynamic alone that this story is pointing to. It must be something deeper than just that, because the addition of the male-female dynamic, we understand that it will help with the multiplying and fill the earth, but why would that necessarily be involved in subduing it? Because there is something, animals have the male female dynamic too, and they're not subduing the earth. That's something we do. Um, so that's why I see, this as being the creation of not just the male female, but in fact the primary element, or maybe the underlying element, which is present in the rest of this part of the narrative, is the idea of the masculine perspective and the feminine perspective. And what we see in this story is the archetype. The man is the archetype of masculinity, right? If he is the first man. Go ahead.
What's the distinction between male and female versus masculine and feminine?
What do you mean?
What's the distinction between that?
Oh, I think they're masculine and feminine is a perspective. It's a way of seeing things, a way of thinking about things, right? There's two different ways to interpret the world, approach the world, address what you find in life, how you confront those things that you're confronted with. There's two different approaches. There's a masculine and a feminine approach.
I think it's important to say that this does play out in a lot of psychological data. I don't have specific studies to reference at the moment, but that does, masculinity and femininity tend to play themselves out in that you can see masculine characteristics and feminine characteristics.
Yeah,
and they can be
dualistic nature.
They can be assigned irreverent of gender,
irrelevant.
But they have irrelevant of gender.
Yeah.
But they can also, they have a tendency to go based on the genders that they're assigned to.
Right. It's not a pure thing. And actually we'll get to in the next couple episodes how I think that's actually presented in this story, is the idea that we aren't a pure one or the other. Because what we'll see here is that essentially the man, the human, is split in two. And that there's a good case to be made that in fact the human might be the right way to interpret when it is saying the man here is the human. And the human is split into two. So in other words, the masculine and the feminine are separated. And then you have in this story, you have the man, which would be the archetype of masculinity, the sort of the pure boiled down condensed version of what it is to be masculine. And then in the woman, you would have the pure boiled down condensed version of what it is to be, feminine. But then their offspring is going to have characteristics of both. So even if you want to take it from if you want to treat this historically, you could have that same idea that, well, Adam here is the genetic, pure genetic idea of a masculine man, and Eve is the pure genetic idea of the feminine woman. Well, what we know with genetics is, but once those mix, the offspring, regardless of male or female, is now going to have elements of masculinity and femininity. So, so that's, I think what we will see here is that we're looking at the archetypes, right? Okay. And the man being the archetype of masculinity, but the task of subduing the earth, the masculine perspective alone is not good. It's not enough. It needs help, and that is the help that's triggered here in this verse. And we'll get more into the next few verses what that means even more and how that takes shape. But
we're not looking at, we're potentially not looking at, because again, we're assuming, people, by the way, that that the helper fit for him is a woman. That's going to be,
we are.
I guess we never even mentioned that. I imagine most people are listening know that.
I'm going to assume you've read a few verses ahead.
Yeah, there we go. Right. But what we're not looking at here is saying that that God's outlining this idea of there is going to be men's work and women's work. in the same way, but more so there are functions for the masculine and the feminine perspective.
Yes.
Because we're making a decision here, not completely, because I guess you can still leave the strictly historical perspective in play, but for the most part we're making a decision and saying, look, Adam and Eve in this context represent something.
Yeah, and I'm saying even if you
pure
do
masculinity and pure femininity. Well, but they're also saying, like, look, Adam's role is not, it's not that Adam can't do everything or Eve can do things that Adam can't, and Adam can do things that Eve can't, because physically, let's say the classic example is Adam is probably stronger and he's bigger and more physically fit. Right. That's not the thing that's being contended here. The thing that's being contended has far more to do with the structure, let me say the lens through which Adam perceives the world versus the lens through which Eve perceives the world, and the structure.
Which you can maintain the historical perspective and still see that in it if you desire.
Yeah.
You can still see that there. But, and more specifically, I guess we'll bring this up now, more specifically as we move through these verses, what we're seeing is not even so much what the role of the masculine and the feminine is in reality. What we end up seeing is the way in which the masculine and the feminine come to sin is what we'll see. The ways in which those two perspectives are sort of susceptible to sin. Mm-hmm. There's one other thing though I want to point out before we sort of wrap up this verse, is that up into this point here, maybe you've caught on or not, I've primarily relied on the term help and not helper, even though the verse we read says helper. And I've seen a handful of different sources here claim that a help is actually a better translation than helper. That what it is saying is not that man needs a helper, man needs help in this task. And that may not seem significant, but again, I actually think that's pointing to something deeper than mere man and woman being present in the story. It's not, that's not suggesting the creation of another type of person is what God is most concerned with, because then he would say helper. What he's most concerned with is creating something that provides assistance to this masculine perspective that is there. Yeah,
it depersonifies it a little bit.
Yes.
That the identity. It's like saying you have a computer system, let's say a means of interpreting data or something like that, an algorithm, or you have a program that you can use. Well, that's a help. That's an assistance. Mm-hmm. That's not a person that's helping you actively. It is a program through which you can interpret the world. And so man here, maybe even being his own program through which he's interpreting the world, needs another program through which he can interpret the world.
Right. And I think what we'll see is that this is represented or housed within this story in a whole nother type of person, because it's a whole nother type of perspective, right?
Well, and because it's a story, and because that's how we've talked about this a lot. That's how we communicate these ideas so often. I mean, well, I guess actually in reality, this may be the first story that does this, but it certainly wouldn't be the last story that would use people as representative of a particular archetype or a particular idea. And when done well, it's very, very powerful.
Yes. So I would say that the idea captured here, that's captured within the creation of another type of person. And I think perhaps the existence of man and woman is a microcosm meant to represent the greater dynamic of the existence of masculine and feminine. But at its core, the story here is about the help that the masculine perspective requires in order to do the task of subduing the earth. And as we'll see, that help is found in the feminine perspective.
Mm-hmm. Can I give one last contention before we move on from this?
Yeah.
Or not a contention, but just a thought that occurs to me is that why is it that the masculine is the one that needs to be told it needs help? There's and I don't want to get too deep into the masculine or feminine verses and flesh them out a little bit, but there's part of me that thinks there is something being communicated there and saying that potentially the purest form of masculinity has the tendency to think it doesn't need help. Right. Whereas that would not be an issue that the purest form of femininity would run into. And so that's why the story's framed the way it is that the masculine in and of itself is not good. Whereas where it needs that complement. Whereas if you created the feminine first, it wouldn't need to be told that it didn't.
Right.
It needs something else, if that makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I think that's along the lines of what you're sort of seeing here, is that that might be the reason for ordering it in that way. It might be, we'll see. I don't know. We'll get to, in a couple of verses from now, we might clarify how we think of that. Because remember, I did say that potentially you could argue that the translation here should be the human and not the man. And so that is interesting. I still contend that, what God is seeing is sort of the overt masculinity, because it is the femininity that is separated out from the human at this point. And so it'd be like that feminine voice is sort of suppressed, I guess, within the human here. And that's why it's separated out and given its own entity in the story, in the form of the woman. But we'll get to that, I guess, when we get to, that grand process, I suppose, of the actual sort of splitting. So all right, with that, we will be back again in a few days, and be sure to like, subscribe, review, share with your friends, email us unschooltheology@protonmail.com, and we will see you then. Thanks.